Okay, why don't we begin then? So good afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are. My name is Courtney Dogger and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit organization that focuses on creating more informed conversations around foreign policy and foreign affairs. So before we begin today, I just wanted to, and before I welcome both our moderator and our speaker, I just wanted to let you know that we'll be putting up a brief poll. We're just trying to better understand who is participating and where you're coming from and how you're finding out about us, because as we switch to this online world, we want to just better understand our constituents. So with that, thank you very much for filling that out. So I'm going to introduce our speaker and our moderator. So today we have Richard Hornick with us. He is currently an adjunct senior fellow at the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. His career in journalism included assignments as executive editor of Asia Week, deputy chief of correspondence and news service director of Time Magazine in New York, as well as serving as Times bureau chief in Warsaw, Boston, Beijing, and Hong Kong. He co-authored Massacre in Beijing, China's Struggle for Democracy with Donald Morrison, and has written for Foreign Affairs, Fortune, the Harvard Business Review, Smithsonian, the New York Times, and Wall Street Journal. He has an MA in Russian Studies from George Washington University and a BA in Political Science from Brown University. From 2007 to 2019, he was lecturer at Stony Brook University and also served as visiting lecturer at the University of Hong Kong in 2012 and at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in spring of 2015. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And today we have Fotis Poliakis, who will be moderating the conversation. He is a member of Network 2020 and is a seasoned professional in strategic and operational matters, bringing transferable skills to international affairs. His career spans 3 decades of entrepreneurship and real estate investments, consulting and finance, as well as corporate C-level positions in trade, consulting, and manufacturing. And he recently made a career shift from real estate to international business and global affairs. He holds a Master of International Affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, a Master in Business Administration from Pace University, and a Bachelor's of Engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fotis to kick off the conversation with Rick. So thank you all for participating, and especially thanks to Rick and Fotis.
Great, thank you very much, Courtney. And thank you for Network 2020. What a great organization. I joined a couple of years ago while I was at Columbia, keeping us very kind with international affairs and also opening the exchange to hear the experts. So during this coronavirus time, you have done such a fabulous job with bringing us all these different subjects and experts. So here we are with Rick, an expert in China, one of the biggest subjects in international affairs and geopolitical affairs, and arguably the #1 subject in our geopolitical active life here in the United States. So we heard, Rick, about this new subject, the wolf warrior. And this is your subject today to start. So if you could please give us a little bit of a background of this new term, and also tangential other subjects that support that claim, and where can this bring us? Is this a good development or a neutral or a bad development? The forum is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think it's important to try to understand this development by looking back at some of the recent history. And I've been observing China for over 30 years. And one of the things that has amazed me over that time is the ability of China to garner very favorable coverage and analysis, and often exceeding the objective observations. And I saw that firsthand in 1987 when I was Beijing bureau chief, and many problems were beginning to surface in China's reforms, corruption, inflation. But you would be hard pressed to go back and find any statements by senior businessmen or officials, diplomats, academics expressing any qualms about what was going to happen in China. And that all, of course, changed very quickly in 1989 when those problems erupted into the protests that became the Tiananmen Square protests, and then the massacre of hundreds of innocent Chinese civilians at the order of Deng Xiaoping. But within a few years, China had recaptured this aura of invincibility and progress. And it was really kind of earth-shaking to watch how quickly people got over this horror of what had happened. And to me, a lot of that involves the baggage that foreigners carry when they look at China. They often see what they want to see in terms of China's politics and culture and economy. But the Chinese are also very, very good at shaping those perceptions and understanding what foreigners want to see and when they want to see it. And a key element of this strategy was Deng Xiaoping's belief that China should hide its brightness and nourish obscurity. That is, speak softly but carry a large stick, and not ruffle too many feathers, and slowly build a peaceful rise of China that would eventually enable it to take its place in the world. That policy lasted for over 3 decades. And then everything changed. My first inkling of this came at a conference I attended in Honolulu at the East-West Center 5 years ago, in which a top Chinese, a top sinologist, American sinologist, mentioned almost in passing how surprised he was that China had changed its strategy for dealing with the South China Sea. He said that, in like 2010, he was convinced that China was succeeding in turning it into its sphere of influence, very peacefully, very quietly, through diplomacy and economic relations. And yet, just in the last year or two before that, China had begun its aggressive policy that we've all read so much about in the last few years, the building of islands, the use of a sort of almost privateers, informal military naval forces to harass different elements of people in the region. And anyway, so at that point, it became clear that China was changing its approach. And I think it's impossible to credit this change to anything except the rise of Xi Jinping, who is clearly China's most powerful leader since Mao Zedong, far more powerful than Deng himself. So we can discuss this individually later, but I just wanted to tick off a few of the examples of this that go beyond the South China Sea, of this wolf warrior diplomacy that we're talking about. So beyond the South China Sea, China's relations with a number of countries have gotten very, very troubled. The most recent example is Canada. I don't know how many of you heard this, but the 2 Canadians who were arrested shortly after Canada arrested the daughter of Huawei, they were charged with espionage yesterday. And this has now created a big to-do with China. The Chinese Foreign Ministry attacked Prime Minister Trudeau today. Similar situation in Sweden, where China has long had very good relations, but over the last few years, the Chinese ambassador has been very aggressive in his denunciations of Swedish authorities, Swedish journalists, and he makes very, very outrageous comments. Australia and New Zealand, again, very, very close allies, friends of China, big trading relationships, large Chinese communities. And yet over the last few years, China has been involved in manipulating politics in those places, and often retaliating for perceived slights by doing things like putting an 80% tariff on Australian barley just overnight because they didn't like something that the government said. Taiwan, which, you know, there was some hope over time that Hong Kong might provide a model for Taiwan's reunification. In the last year, China has ramped up its propaganda against the president of Taiwan. They tried very hard to make sure she wasn't reelected. She was reelected overwhelmingly. India, two of the biggest powers in the world, facing off in the Himalayas. For the first time since 1970, there was an armed clash there in the last week or so. Very dangerous. WTO, China, which has benefited greatly from the WTO, insisted a few years ago that it be given market economy status, which would give it even more advantages. And initially, the only pushback was from the United States, but eventually this became so aggressive that even the EU has come out against it. And again, just in the last few days, China has quietly dropped that request. And then we can't not talk about COVID. The response of China in trying to use its access to masks and ventilators and that sort of thing as a way of affecting diplomatic relations, propaganda, and finally, something that I'm sure many of the people who are listening today will be familiar with, Hong Kong. Hong Kong was to be the model for how China would comport itself in international relations. One country, two systems was guaranteed for 50 years. Well, we haven't made 25 years, and it's pretty much been thrown out the window with this new national security law that's being put in. So then, quickly, I just want to talk briefly about the impact of this. So in the European Union, they are now coming up with new policies to restrict Chinese imports and investment. 5G. Huawei looked like it was going to be a global leader, but China's aggressiveness in pushing Huawei has caused many countries to step back. Even NATO is now talking about having a China policy, which it never had before. India has just signed a new military agreement with Australia and may well do so with the United States because of its relations with China. The WTO has, again, just in the last week or so, decided to not just not let China become a market economy member, but also has made statements that question whether or not the WTO is prepared to have China in it at all 20 years ago. And then COVID, China's overreaction on COVID in many cases has really hurt its relations. A recent public opinion poll in Germany said that 74% felt that China had dishonestly reported its infection figures, and only 10% of the German people want to have closer relations with China, which is a big change. Then we have Hong Kong, which is sure to lose its special status, which will hurt China's economy. And I haven't even talked about Belt and Road, which is something I know you're very interested in, Fotis. It could have been one of the great PR successes of the 21st century. And in fact, there's increasing resistance to it because of China's aggressive use of loans and other things. So needless to say, of course, all of this is happening at a time when the United States is not exactly covering itself in glory overseas. But I think that even emphasizes this even more, the opportunity cost that China has had. I think China's status in the world could be much, much higher right now had it not been for this so-called wolf warrior foreign policy. So the question I want to raise today, and of course we'll have many others, during the discussion, but why does China pursue it? What, if it doesn't seem to be working, why continue with it? And I think, again, it has to go back to Xi Jinping and his ruling philosophy. So Deng Xiaoping was a consensus builder, and one of his great victories was to turn Chinese politics into something other than a zero-sum game, which it was under Mao, where if you disagreed with Mao and you lost, you were done. Well, Xi Jinping, like Mao, views politics as a zero-sum game. He's eliminated all opposition, and just as with Mao, foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. And so he has, in fact, turned that into also a zero-sum game, because the Chinese support for the Chinese Communist Party, public support, rests on two pillars: economics and nationalism. And even before COVID, the economy was starting to slow down. Now with COVID, the economy is in great danger. So having a very strong nationalistic foreign policy is viewed by Xi as being something that helps build his credibility and legitimacy. So where does that leave us, to your question? What's going to happen going forward? I think we're in a very dangerous time. We have, and I don't mean that in the sense of, some sort of rapid crisis, some military crisis. But I do think that the world is frayed in a way it hasn't been in a long, long time, economically, socially, politically. And to have both a very aggressive American foreign policy and a Chinese version of Trump's "Make America Great Again." I think a lot of what Xi is saying to his public is "Make China great again." We're going to be the top country in the world, and that's very appealing. That's a big political message for him. And so you have the two strongest powers who should be trying to work together at this point in time to calm the waters. And I see no prospect of that at any time in the near future. So on that cheerful note, I'll turn it over to you. Oops.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. That was a great summary of where we are and where we have been and the general direction. Thinking where the source of the Chinese power is, the state power, mm-hmm. I'm sure it involves obviously the leader and the Communist Party. How do these two get together, and how does that get transmitted to become state power, the sovereign powers? And which one is the most prevalent that drives the rest? So we have issues in security, the commercial side, One Belt, One Road, governance side, the environment, economy, trade, finance. Which one do you think is the preferred point of the spear, and is that a good thing for them, and where would that lead them?
So one of the so as Courtney mentioned, my academic degree is in Russian studies, Soviet studies. So I spent a lot of time studying Marxism, Leninism, and you cannot understand China without understanding Leninist governing philosophy. So the state that exists, but only as an instrument of the party. And the party, it goes from the top of society to the bottom of society. And in this case, right now, that state, that party is directed entirely by one man. So Xi Jinping, on top of everything else, has centralized power into his own personal party secretary office. So the foreign ministry, all of these, the defense ministry, they've all been sidelined by these groups that report directly to Xi Jinping. And so, for example, when you see the Swedish ambassador saying crazy things about, how the Swedes are a bunch of lightweights who shouldn't dare to take on heavyweights like China, he is not trying to influence Sweden. He's trying to curry favor with Xi Jinping. Not unlike some of what you see with some government officials and Donald Trump. There's an audience of one, and that one is Xi Jinping. And so on all of these levels, on economics, on foreign policy, it all goes back to him and his vision of what it will take to make China the global superpower that he thinks it deserves to be and should always have been.
Interesting, thank you. So that brings us to a little more dangerous situation, right? Having to depend on the abilities of one man in a very close circle to understand what is happening and then react to it, and maybe they go off the deep end.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of recent events that bring China to be a lot more aggressive than we were used to be, where they used to show to us with the 9 gas line that started almost 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And they built those islands,
Mm-hmm.
and we haven't heard anything about those islands. I mean, we still do the freedom of navigation
Mm-hmm.
sail passes, but nothing has happened. No Hadith, nothing happened. But all of a sudden now the Himalayas becoming the point.
There have been, I'm sure your naval colleagues will tell you, there have been quite a few very dangerous close encounters between U.S. Navy and Chinese Navy forces. In addition, they have this sort of very informal military, naval military forces. These are armed fishing boats that go around, trying to bully locals and so forth. I mean, to me, one of the most interesting things that's gone on as they've built these islands and armed them, they have pushed farther south. So, for example, as you may have heard, they have this thing called the 9-dot line, which is supposedly a map that shows what China's sphere of influence should be in the South China Sea. And it goes all the way down to Indonesia. And Indonesia was actually, kind of on China's side in a lot of these disputes. Well, in the last month, China has picked a fight with Indonesia over, I think, fishing grounds or something, but it's almost seems irrational. So again, I go back to my question, why? Why is it so aggressive? What's going on there? What does that tell you about domestic politics in China? And it tells me, I mean, this is pure speculation. And again, I'm looking forward to the questions from the group. But it tells me that things are not going that well internally. It doesn't. These are counterproductive moves from a foreign policy point of view. You're alienating your potential allies and friends. Why? Because I would argue because Xi Jinping has centered all the power in his office. And so therefore he's responsible for not just China's successes, but now for its failures, including economic, the COVID response. I mean, he disappeared for 3 weeks at the beginning of the COVID response, mostly because he didn't want to take responsibility for it. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with him because he has asserted complete control. So my concern, or not concern, but my theory is that, we have always operated under the assumption that the Chinese government knows a lot more about what's going on inside their borders than I do, right? They know, they have all sorts of ways of getting information. They know where there's unrest. They used to release every year a survey of how many domestic disturbances there were in China. And about 10 years ago, they stopped releasing because they got up to about 180,000 and they didn't want the information. Anyway, so my belief is that there are a lot of unhappy people in China and the government knows it, and they're using this nationalist aggressive foreign policy as a way of tamping down those issues.
Right. And exporting some of that pressure to and nationalizing it so they can get better returns.
Yeah.
Interesting. So following their aggressiveness, and I'm going to ask this one last question and then go to the audience. Their export machine, obviously their indigenization of some of the technology that they have received as benefits of allowing others to have business there, the One Belt, One Road system. So they went with the military to the Nine Dash Line. They didn't make a lot of inroads there. They made a lot of enemies, not many friends. But the One Belt, One Road may be the counter to that, making more friends than enemies. They gave them a lot of money. They're expecting some oil back, some other benefits. Is that the counter? Is that the big strategy?
Well, actually, I would argue that if it handled properly, it would have been. But it hasn't been handled properly because they've pushed a lot of questionable loans on developing countries. There's already been pushback from Malaysia about a big railroad development that was going to be built there. There's pushback in Sri Lanka, even in Africa, where you could argue they've had their most success. People are beginning to get tired of these development projects that always seem to involve only Chinese workers. So they're building these railroads. They're not employing Kenyans. They're bringing in lots of Chinese who then stay behind and get involved in local economy and stuff. Anyway, that I think the jury's still out on One Belt, One Road. Although I also think that when they started this, they thought they had unlimited capital. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think their capital is considerably more limited for this sort of thing than before. And they've got a lot of projects that are just not panning out very well, because it was this kind of crazy enthusiasm, and anyway. So I agree with you. I think it should have been the counter to a lot of this stuff, but I don't think it's worked out quite that way.
Especially in the African continent, where there's plenty of opportunity for them, and they have been there for a long time.
Right.
And it seems that they were making inroads compared to US or Europe.
Right. Yeah,
my esteemed colleague, Lisa Rhodes, was going to ask a question. If she's open and available, Brian, if you could please allow her to unmute. Lisa? No? Okay. Well, I will ask one more question, and then we'll go there. The crisis, the coronavirus crisis, a lot of fingers are pointing in that direction. I don't have personally the evidence to say that's where it started, but we all know about those the laboratories that existed there, and the information wasn't forthcoming. Obviously, that damaged them a lot in the eyes of a lot of people in the world. And this is now the third pandemic or disease that came out of China. What can they do to prevent that and to help with the World Health Organization? And what can we do now vis-a-vis our supply chains? So I'm switching a little bit from the security to more trade and finance and
it's a matter of national security. Obviously, health is important. I mean, I think the speculation about how it started is not productive, and it's certainly not I mean, whether it came from a bat or a laboratory or whatever it was. As you say, this is not the first infectious disease that spread out of China. To me, the big question here is, or the big issue, is China's governance system, and can it respond to these sorts of problems going forward? Because they set up, after SARS, they set up amazing reporting networks to make sure that they didn't get blindsided again. And yet they got blindsided. Why? Well, I would argue that it was because Xi Jinping wants to control everything, and so they have really reimposed complete controls on information exchanges in China. And so when you had the first inklings of this in December, that information never got up to the top authorities. And part of it is, you know, if you're an official in Wuhan, you don't want to be calling up your boss in Beijing and saying, hey, we got a problem here. I don't know if any of you have seen Chernobyl, the HBO thing, but believe me, that's how these systems work. You do not get ahead as a bureaucrat by telling people bad news. You know? So anyway, I think that's a big question the world has to grapple with, because unless China can prove that it's learned its lessons in terms of information flows on these sorts of things, you know, there's going to be another one of these in a few years.
And as a result, it looks like not only the U.S. administration, on a bipartisan level, it's very soured on that note with China, but it looks like the business is now putting the brakes on having so much exposure to China itself, and now it's becoming more of an Indo-Pacific market as opposed to the China market. So yeah. What would you say about our supply chain?
That had begun several years ago. There was the idea of decoupling didn't start with COVID. It started several years ago. Partially, it's a result of reputational risk among foreign companies. Do you really want to be associated with anything in Xinjiang, where there are concentration camps of 1 million people? What's going on in Hong Kong offers also reputational risk and supply chain risk as well. So people have been moving slowly to Indonesia, to Vietnam, to Pakistan, anywhere, trying to diversify their supply chains. The problem is China is still the 800-pound gorilla in global manufacturing, so it's going to take a while. But much of what they produce is easily produced elsewhere. It's just that it was just so damn easy to work in China and have your supply chains. You never had to ask any questions. They took care of everything. And, so I think, supply chains generally, forget about China, just-in-time inventories. I think people are going to be rethinking that as well. So we're entering a brave new world of that sort of thing, which I used to know a lot about, but I haven't studied in a few years. So I think we should go to the questions from the group.
Absolutely. There is one from Lena says that in 2018, China bought one of the big ports in Europe outside Athens in Piraeus, which is one of their highlights on the investments. And now the EU is trying to stop further investments, quote unquote, in the EU. Mm-hmm. What is your thought on the fear of Chinese takeover of Europe? And we saw a recent reaction by Germany as well.
So actually, the EU is developing a new policy, as I said earlier, on investments. One of their big fears is that because of the COVID economic collapse, a lot of companies are going to be distressed, and they're going to be looking for bailouts or new investors. And those would maybe come from China. And so they've already had quite a bit of pushback on certain investments in technologically advanced companies. But I think what's probably going to happen is that was always done on a country by country basis. And I think what we may be seeing is a European EU version of what we call here in the US CFIUS, the Committee for whatever investment which has to approve all foreign investments to make sure that our technologies aren't being taken over. By the way, and again, China is not helping itself. A Chinese company owns Volvo, and they've been operating very, very successfully by letting Volvo, continue to be in Sweden. And now the word is coming out that they're going to take total control They're going to start making, them take components made in China. It's going to ruin the Volvo brand, but it also makes people think twice about whether or not you want to have China as a major investor in your company.
I do not see another one from the network. Let me go to another one of the questions that we had.
But I'm looking at some here.
Oh, you are okay. I have not.
Yeah. There are a few good questions in the Q&A box. If you can see them, Rick, do you want to just
please go
read
ahead.
it out loud? So
I didn't see them.
yeah.
Do you want me to do it?
Yes, please.
Mr. Hornick, can you talk about the this is from Shantanu Roy. Can you talk about the likeliness of China joining the New START treaty? If China chooses to join, how will that impact China's foreign policy? I can't see that any progress in that area for quite a while. Again, China, in many ways, it wouldn't make sense for China to join START because its arsenal is so much smaller than Russia's or the United States. So anyway, there's I'm not going to read any from anonymous attendees, if that's okay. From Rafal Vishnevsky, I know that this is a huge question, but I would like to ask the panelists, what is their view of China's political future post-2022? Will Xi Jinping go Putin's way and prolong his term in power, or maybe some kind of succession will be initiated? In other words, is growing personalism of power in China, or is return to collective leadership still possible? That is definitely, Rafal, the $64,000 billion question. By all indications, Xi seems in no rush to give up power. He had the constitution changed at the last party Congress so that he can continue to serve. And I think he, as I said, it's really fascinating to me how he has changed the political structure and expectations of China from Deng. Now, Deng was a reaction to Mao and Mao's complete power. And then over the last, so Deng, as I said, made it no longer a zero-sum game. And Xi has made it a zero-sum game. He has imprisoned, hundreds of high-ranking officials on corruption charges. But, if you know anything about China, you know that there is nobody at any level who hasn't got some relative who's corrupt. Political corruption investigations are by necessity political. And so there are a lot of people who would like to see him go. And there are a lot of people who, if they could get rid of him, get him to step aside, he and his family might be in trouble. So I think I did a piece for a political risk journal a couple of years ago, entitled the ultimate risk of ultimate power. And I think, once you've put yourself in that position, there's no escape route. He's in for a penny, in for a pound. I don't see any way he could give up power.
Great, thank you. Now I have the Q&A in front of me, so I can see that. There's a great question from Gregory Mitrovich about the decoupling that we've been talking about, the economic decoupling, and maybe other cultural and other ways. So he's asking, given the connection between domestic politics and foreign policy, how will global decoupling impact Xi's long-term domestic authority?
That's a great question because, again, I would argue that this is, everything is in the end going to be counterproductive. I think the total control over information is counterproductive to China's growth and prosperity. I think, getting into battles with every outside country is in the long run not good for China. So I don't think, you have to really look at it from his point of view. And, he's torn. he wants China to develop. He wants it to be, the China dream. He wants it to be great again. But he doesn't want to pay the price for that. He doesn't want to have the openness of society. He doesn't want to have, you cannot have indigenous innovation without having horizontal communication channels. It's just not going to happen. You cannot buy your way to innovation. I mean, look at Microsoft. Microsoft spent billions and billions of dollars in the 80s and 90s on innovation, and it was all wasted. And it was wasted because it was all stuff coming from the top. Innovation bubbles up from the bottom, and it's all about people talking and making, that. So I see this as very, very counterproductive. But it's also, you can't predict that this is going to create social unrest or whatever. I think that's a fool's game. But I in all my years as a journalist, the one thing that bothered me more than anything else was failure to reach potential. I see, I covered economics, I covered countries. I see places that I think could be so much better. I think China was heading that way before Xi Jinping came. They were using social media to create feedback loops with society, so that you heard about things like COVID and corrupt officials and all these other things. And they've shut all of that down. So I can't be optimistic about China right now. I'm not going to be a catastrophist, though. I think muddling along is a very, very plausible alternative.
So they have used that power that they had before for that horizontal and lateral communication to control by the state, which fired back at them.
Yeah, right.
There's a very good question by Alexander Leopold about the economic stagnation that we see or foresee about China, and all the China skeptics and others talking about from 92 on that after Germany and Japan, we will be next in their way to becoming the leading economy in the world, and that has not happened. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, from your perspective, why it has not happened? And you have mentioned quite a few things. And what's a prediction, if you?
I mean, first of all, we love to have the hot new things. So you may remember in the 1980s, Ezra Vogel, published a book, Japan is Number One. It was going to take over the world, and then the EU, and then we had the BRICS, and now, anyway. So there's a lot of flavor of the month of that sort of thing. But China's biggest problem is something mathematicians call the law of large numbers. If you've got 100 growing by 10%, that's just 10. But eventually that 10, you can't keep growing at that rate, because eventually you get to 1 trillion, and you're not going to add 100 billion, in a year. So China has grown so fast for so long, it had to start to slow down. The other thing that's happened is, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1994 entitled Bursting China's Bubble. And it was how their financial system was not sustainable, because they were, just recapitalizing, all of these bad loans. Well, it turns out that, they can do that for a long time. But as with Japan, after a while, what it does is it degrades the power of investment. So $1 of new investment in the old days used to get you more than $1 in GDP growth, multiples in a place like China and Japan. But now it gets you less than a dime. And so the efficiency is, the leverage no longer exists. So they were beginning to confront this problem last year. And I'll give them credit. I think, they'll figure some way out of that. But with COVID, I think it's really going to make it, much more difficult. And I think, their growth rates, which, by the way, all of Chinese statistics are how shall I put it?
Tainted.
Huh?
Tainted.
No. Well, they're padded. I mean, again, go back to you're a local official. You know, they say, how much did your GDP grow last year? You say, oh, 10%. You know, anyway, there are many quotes from Chinese officials anyway.
There's a great question that is in underlying in many other subjects about the human rights and the people and the different strata, the middle class that is growing, the upper class that is in the Communist Party, and obviously the labor class that is still struggling. Are the human rights issues what is holding China from becoming the superpower?
No, I mean, I never bought into this dichotomy that somehow, China had to become a democracy in order to succeed. I think that's in many ways a false choice that's been, presented by people over the years. I do think a good friend of mine, who's a very thoughtful observer of China, years ago, he said, the Chinese don't want democracy. Maybe at the local level, they don't want to vote for president. They want accountability. They want to be able to, to have some predictability about their lives, about how they're going to be treated by the justice system. And that would be, a huge improvement. And that would, but it's not our role to, to tell China how to, make its government. I think we do have a duty to speak out when we see massive violations of human rights, such as what's going on in Xinjiang. But, the Chinese say the basic human right is to have food and a job. Well, there are many places in the West that don't fulfill that for people. I think those conversations, are useful for, the Oxford Debating Society. But in real life, I think, again, I thought China was heading towards more of a system of accountability, and I don't think it is now. And I think that's a shame, but I don't think there's anything we can do about it. I do think that we made a big mistake in the West, assuming that economic growth and prosperity would make China a less authoritarian state. That was a narrative that was largely created by, sorry for my Republican friends in the audience, but by Republicans and businessmen to justify trading with a communist dictatorship. The more we do it, the better they're going to get, and they're all drinking Coca-Cola, and someday they'll be just like us. Well, that's not going to happen.
And funny thing, the WTO isn't considering China still a developing country, and they have a lot of brakes on that, which I found such a contradiction. Right. There's another great question from Susan Spelius. We have allowed almost 300,000 of Chinese students every year in the United States, scientists and everyone. Obviously, we're very afraid of some of that technology going back and forth with proven cases, obviously the Harvard chemistry chairman. What shall we do? What would be a good reaction to protect ourselves, but also to still be open, in the immigration, in the cultural exchanges, et cetera?
I think one of the problems is that, for a long time, we didn't bother enforcing the laws that were on the books. So there are laws that if you are getting federal money, you cannot get money from another government if you're doing research. And, they're not just Chinese academics who are guilty of doing this, but also American academics. So, we got kind of sloppy. So I think just enforcing some of those rules. At the end of the day, technology theft, yes, it gets you a certain way, but I covered the Soviet Union in the 70s, and there was all sorts of export controls, and everything I saw taught me that if the Soviets stole like the IBM 360 technology, yeah, they could produce it, but it took them several years, and by the time they had it, IBM had moved on. So you're never going to get ahead that way. I think we benefit enormously from having Chinese students here. They are the backbone of many, many laboratories, the research and everything. Many of them stay here. They have no desire to go back to China. And that may be even more the case now. Although, unfortunately, the racism that has surfaced in many Americans' response to COVID has made many Chinese and Asians feel uncomfortable to be here, which I think is a tragedy. It's the worst part of COVID in many ways, is the what it's done to our image of these people. But
Thank you. There's a great question from Lisa Rhodes. Can you provide social perspective on rebalancing the global supply chain given the job losses that would and are impacting China?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's that's going to be a big problem. There are something like 300 migrant workers in China, and I believe most of them have not yet gone back to the cities. They're not allowed back, or there's discrimination against them now. You raised this point earlier about the class divisions within China, which is kind of amusing since it's supposed to be a communist society.
Yeah.
But it's clear, and the real division is people. It's urban rural more than anything else, actually. Because the workers, in all of these factories over the years that created the supply chain for us, they were mostly migrants from rural areas, and that there, as I said earlier, there are a whole bunch of questions that have been raised that by COVID that I don't see any simple solution to. Whether or not but I don't believe that redoing the supply chain so there's more onshoring of production in the United States is that's not going to create lots of jobs. I think the bigger challenge is what happens to the underemployed or unemployed in China as decoupling proceeds. Even if it's not at a breakneck pace, it's definitely going to proceed. And unless China can do more of its, and build its own domestic economy more, then I think they're going to be facing, some serious social problems. But again, I'm not, going to predict there's going to be, riots in the streets.
There's a great question from Frank Bean, actually. You and I, we had a prior conversation before where you mentioned Michael Gorbachev's name as a historical attempt to reform, and that didn't go as well. So the question is, Xi Jinping watched Michael Gorbachev attempt to reform the Soviet system only to have the USSR collapse spectacularly.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hornig, do you think this means the Chinese Communist Party understands it can only survive if it does not attempt to reform what has become an increasingly authoritarian and reactive dictatorship?
Well, I mean, the reason Deng Xiaoping, ordered the massacre of hundreds, if not thousands, of innocent civilians in 1989 was because he learned that lesson then. I mean, this was, I could spend a whole hour talking about this particular element because I was both in China in 1989 before the massacre and after, and in Eastern Europe for the fall of communism. So it was quite a year. I think what's interesting is Deng realized that they had to be an exercise of power, but he felt it could be done in pulses, if you will, that you could keep a lid on by just watching things go, and then stepping in when necessary. And to me, the difference with Xi is that he's a complete control freak. He's not willing to allow there to be any dissent whatsoever. And I think that's not the best way to run an economy, or a society. But anyway, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the Chinese learned their lesson from Gorbachev's failure. But Gorbachev, And this is, again, I wouldn't want his job. I don't want Xi Jinping's job. It's a nightmare. But Gorbachev was faced with this horrible dilemma. He knew that the Soviet Union's economy could not grow unless he eased up, unless he allowed horizontal communications. That's what Glasnost was all about. And they, but how do you get there? Anyway, so yeah, it's.
I may have the last question, Courtney. Correct me if I'm wrong. We've got 4 minutes to go. And I will combine a couple of them that they're out in the Q&A. And we talk about and we read about and we all studied about the Thucydides' trap of the Athenian general with the Peloponnesian Wars between the Athenians and the Spartans. And it seems that a lot of people looking at that as an inevitable thing, or it only can happen in the field of military conflict. Mm-hmm. I think it will be a combination of a lot of the above and a little hotspots here. If you holistically look at that trap, are we in a trap? And I'm not talking about just the US, because it looks like the US may get together with the EU. But if you put China versus others in their ascension to power, is that a possibility, and to what degree?
Yeah, I think one of the problems with historical parallels like that is that somebody once said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it may rhyme. The Peloponnesian Wars that was a specific time, a specific place, very limited field, very militarily oriented. There was no commercial. The world is a much different place right now, and there are many, many different outlets for different countries. I don't see that we're necessarily in that trap. I think a trap means that there are no other avenues, and I think there are lots of different avenues, and I think we will be competing with China on a very, very aggressive basis, even if Donald Trump is not reelected. I think the next administration is going to have to also be, fairly tough on China, especially on things like technology transfers, intellectual property, tariffs. I'm a big believer in reciprocity. I think, one of the reasons that our relations with China are so bad is that we never exercise reciprocity. We let them believe that they could pretty much get away with anything. As a journalist, we used to joke that, if in 1985, if an American journalist was kicked out of Beijing, the Reagan administration would reciprocate by kicking an American journalist out of Washington, D.C. So it's, but we haven't really held them accountable in many ways. And I think that could be the basis of a more rational relationship going forward. So no, I'm not. As I say, I'm not a catastrophist, and I think that's an unlikely scenario at best.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was very informative. We caught up with on a lot of subjects we touched upon superficially in others. Thank you very much for your wisdom and knowledge.
My pleasure.
And Courtney, thank you for allowing us this forum to hear from so many different people. And please continue. Yeah. We'll be watching.
Thank you, Fotis, for leading a great discussion, and Rick, just for all the information. I felt like we could keep going, and I was restraining myself from asking questions. So, hopefully we'll be able to do this again. For those of you who are listening, our next briefing will actually be, we just put it up. It will be on this coming a week from today. Yes, it's all a blur. And it's with Dr. Lim. And she is essentially the Deborah Birx of Singapore and Asia. She went back from Seattle and during I believe the SARS outbreak, and so she is a leading infectious disease expert. And I think that there is a lot of things that we can learn as we adapt to trying to reopen, and we can learn a lot from Singapore, and she will be ready to comment on that. So please join us, and that's next Monday at 10 a.m. Eastern time. And we will continue to post new briefings on our website. A lot of these are going up on our YouTube channel, so please do subscribe. And a big thank you to those of you who have donated. We are trying to keep these briefings free and open to all. So, but it does take a community. And so if you're enjoying, we would really appreciate any donation that you can make will really help us be able to keep these available. So, which is what we hope to do, even as we go back to a new normal. So thank you, everyone. A special thanks to Fotis and Rick. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.